Fallacy number 4, the network is secure. Now, briefly speaking about security, because it could be its own 5-day course. There's a saying in the security world that the only secure machine is one that is disconnected from the network, preferably turned off, and if possible, buried in concrete somewhere. But even then, that's not 100%. You can't be 100% safe. Given that your machines are not buried in concrete, they're turned on, they're connected to some network, they are exposed at one level or another. Now, let's talk briefly about the different types of users that are out there. Obviously, let's say your average business user is not the most technically savvy, and they can do all sorts of dumb stuff if they were given administrative access to a machine, which is why we don't give it to them. But for the security savvy, which is us in the organization, even we make a mistake now and then. So who's been to a conference in the past year? Raise your hand. Some kind of, leave your hand up if you took some sort of DVD or thumb drive from a vendor at a booth. Okay, I got some hands that are still up. Leave your hand up if you actually put that into a machine. Okay, good. Because as developers, we often run with administrative privileges, right? You put a DVD or a thumb drive that you got from a vendor at a conference into a machine, you don't really know what's on there, right? Right at that moment, your machine can be owned. And then from there, anything that your machine is connected to and everything that you have privileges to can similarly be owned. So understand that a lot of times the point of entry for bad stuff into all sorts of different environments is human beings, which is why hackers tend to prefer the model of social engineering as opposed to actually brute force hacking. And one of the best known hackers of all times, Kevin Mitnick, that was his model. He would walk into some office building wearing some sort of dorky hat and say he was from IT and here to solve the problems they've been having with their email. And just let him right in. I'd say, sure, you fix whatever email thing. And like, yeah, I've heard that you've had problems. Some emails get lost and it takes a long time. And you just get access to anything and be able to muck around in there, touching the physical hardware. Because as human beings, we're trusting creatures. So be aware of that social engineering is often a big problem. I want to talk about, again, this is not a course on how to hack systems, but I want you to understand that the attack vectors from 40 years ago, when things like this were originally written, have gotten a lot more complex. So let's start with this scenario, all right? Let's say that you wanted to steal a bunch of data from an organization. Option number 1, you're going to do some really complex technical hack. Option number 2, you start down this path. You figure out, well, how can I find out who is the person in the organization that has access to all of their data? What do? You go onto LinkedIn. You type in DBA and the name of the company, and now you know all of the people in the organization that have those types of rights. It used to be hard to figure that out. Let's see, how could I possibly access and befriend a person like this? Luckily these days we've got Facebook, Twitter. Now, for a lot of us, we might not be the canonical Facebook users, but there are some people out there that are putting the names of their dogs and their kids and the school and all of their lives are on Facebook. And they're just sharing all of that. Once upon a time, it was really hard to get that information. Birthdays, phone numbers, all of that's online these days. Now, let me take one last step, and this is where it moves from the just researching into the downright criminal. Imagine you're the DBA of an organization, and somebody anonymously messages you, said, I know where your kids go to school, If you don't take a backup of the database, put it on a thumb drive, and drop that off in some location that I'll tell you about later on, something bad is going to happen to your kids. Would you do it? See, sometimes accessing the data of an organization doesn't mean, oh, we're going to do a distributed denial of service attack, and we're going to decrypt this, and we're going to do that. Often it's the human vector that is the most dangerous one. And think about your systems. Who would notice if last week's database backup walked out of your organization? You've got all of these systems in place to protect your production systems. What about the database backups? All right? Now, this is not to get you all scared and worried about Facebook and Twitter and all those types of things, even though there is cause for concern. But that what's available today, again, talking about compared to 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, things have gotten a lot more exposed than ever before. It's not so much a question of if you will get hacked, it's a question of when you will get hacked. All right? And that's the important message that we need to give to our business stakeholders. Luckily, or unluckily, depending on how you want to look at it, there have been enough high-profile hacks that you can sort of shake that stick at management and say, do you want to be the next Sony PlayStation that is dealing with a hack, or Target, or any of the other list of high-profile CEOs that had to go on national media and to apologize to their consumers and. Usually that threat is enough to get budget and time to do something about security. But you need to be sure that you're not communicating that we're going to fix that problem 100% for you. Right? You need to communicate that, look, we're going to make sure that there's no SQL injection attacks and cross-site scripting and cross-site request forgery, and make sure that all of our certificates are up to date and that the servers are patched and. Still, that might not be enough. So what we need to do is we need to understand what's the cost of solving something, what is the risk that we're protecting against, and there's always going to be some point where it stops being worth it. So, for example, Wi-Fi. Who uses Wi-Fi in their organization? Yes? Do you know that Wi-Fi can be picked up by an antenna that costs less than $1,000 from across the street? That Wi-Fi is exposed to a certain type of hack where after a machine gets kicked off of the Wi-Fi network, it reconnects to using the exact same token that it got the first time, that allows other machines to spoof and to connect to the network with one of those tokens. This is a hack that can be done from a coffee shop across your office for under, I don't know, $2,000 in terms of hardware. So unless you're willing to invest in having a building that is protected from Wi-Fi leakage, that is an attack vector that you need to be aware of. Not necessarily you, but somebody in the organization needs to be saying, is it worthwhile to move to a different building or to stop using Wi-Fi altogether? There are costs to these things. Yeah.
Isn't there a difference between saying that the system is secure and the network is secure?
Well, is there a difference between the system and the network being secure? In many ways, they go hand in hand. That there are attack vectors that come in from the system perspective. There are attack vectors that come in from the network perspective. And when talking about system, there's, let's call it operating system, and then there is the business system.
I think the points you're making are mostly about that the system is not secure. Phishing attacks and all these kinds of things, but just for the network traffic, would you say that it's insecure to make a network connection, even if you use certificates and cryptography, etc.? So
let me take your question and pivot it to another direction. There was I'd say well-publicized vulnerability a number of years ago between two different services, very well known, Amazon and Apple, iTunes. Right? What happened was that I think it was iTunes that if you lost access to your account, it would show you the last 4 digits of the credit card that you had on file, and then ask you to retype in the rest of the credit card in order to get access to it. Now, Amazon used those last 4 digits of the credit card that you had on file in order for you to get access to an account that you had lost access to. So it was enough if somebody had your email address, they could naturally assume that there's a pretty good chance that you were both on iTunes and on Amazon. And then they went into the password reset functionality of iTunes, got your last 4 digits of the credit card, then owned your Amazon, and then from having access to Amazon, they could find out all sorts of other information about you. So that is a systems level vulnerability where it's not one system by itself, but it's the combination of 2 different systems that weren't aligned in terms of their security profile that exposed a vulnerability. So even in that case that all of the networks were 100% secure, the systems ended up being compromised. All right? Like I said, we can do a whole 5-day class just about security and vulnerabilities and things like that. Again, the important thing to understand, it's not a question of if you will get hacked, it's a question of when. There will be some kind of breach somewhere. So you need to talk about it, and here's the thing, you want to get the rest of the business parts of the organization involved. This is not just a technical problem. It's better to have the lawyers in the room to say, well, we should change our end user license agreement so that it says, even if we get hacked, we're not legally liable for any of your data. And we'll bury that on page 23 of a 47-page EULA, knowing that nobody's going to read it. They're just going to click agree and move on. Because that's what lawyers do, right? And then we're going to have the PR people that are going to think about how are we going to spin this in advance of this blowing up in our face. Right? So I know as developers, the last thing you want to do is talk to PR people or to lawyers. All right? You don't have to talk to them much beyond to say, look, I'm going to do as much as I can to make sure that the systems are technically safe. That might not be enough. You guys should think about and come up with a plan B for when this thing blows up in our face. And have that ready. All right, so you don't need to talk to them any more than that, but just communicate the expectation of technical safety and security more accurately. All right? So if anything, things are just getting worse and worse over time. The ability to build systems that are secure is becoming more difficult. The cloud is not only for our benefit. There are now much more powerful machines available that are all interlinked with each other. You're probably familiar of the world of Bitcoin. Bitcoin ultimately finances a lot of the black hat security operations that are out there. It's become much easier for people to pay for attacks against each other. The development of Bitcoin has coincided, has actually created a financial model that has developed much more powerful machines for the purposes of doing number crunching that is very good at decryption. So the fact that you thought, oh, I've encrypted this thing with triple AES 256, that means it'll never be hacked. Wait a year, and there will be a new category of hardware that is able to decrypt all of that in under a day. So the strength of machine hardware, on the one hand, it's good for us because we get more hardware to run faster systems on. On the bad side, it means that once something gets hacked or once something gets exposed, the strength of the machines that are able to crack that are they're much stronger, they're able to crack it that much faster. So it's just going to get worse.